This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us tonight Dr. Buck Melton. Welcome, Buck.
Glad to be here.
We have you here in a moment of national travail. Lots of terrible things happening in the world right now. We're in the middle of a corona pan-epidemic, and lots of things are happening. Lots of issues are out there. The government is trying to do everything it can to control the epidemic. And I notice tonight you're not wearing a mask, nor am I wearing a mask.
Well, my wife suggested that we do so, and I need to give
right?
her a shout out to her. She said we both ought to come on with masks.
I think that's the point. So. And now, if we were just to discuss this, I mean, firstly, there are people that would say these are the things we need to do to minimize the impact of this epidemic. These are reasonable things to do, and many of those arguments interfere with civil liberties. And I'm going to throw you the football at that point. I know you're an expert on such subjects, but what is it? Let's say I'll start with this: religion. So, can the government ban church services?
I don't know why there's been such a furor about this, and I will go on record to say that I am a big-time civil libertarian because I believe that in the past 50 or 60 years we have seen in many ways an erosion of our civil liberties. But that's a no-brainer. Of course the government can do that. At the state level especially, and when I use the word state, I'm also including city, county, government, state agencies. I'm talking about anything other than the national government. The state has traditionally had what is called the police power. And that is a very broad power to pass laws for the protection of public health, safety, welfare, and yes, even morals, even though there's a huge debate over legislating morality, that these are the traditional realms of the state police power. Now, that long predates the United States Constitution. That goes all the way back to the colonial period. Now, the police power, the state police power, does have to comport with constitutional requirements, and there is a First Amendment that protects the free exercise of religion. But there's a series of tests that the Supreme Court has developed over the centuries to deal with situations like this. And a law targeting religion specifically, and perhaps even religion tangentially. A law saying no public gatherings of more than 50 people, and that would apply to church meetings as well as football games.
Yes.
You would apply what is called the standard of strict scrutiny. And strict scrutiny puts the heaviest burden on the government to show that what it is doing is constitutional. But when you're dealing with a pandemic, the government can easily meet that burden. It's a three-pronged test. Number one, you ask, is there a compelling government interest here? And if we're talking about the deaths of thousands of people, yeah, I think it's easy to say, yeah, we've met the compelling interest test. All right, second, since we've met the compelling interest test, is this law narrowly tailored to achieve this interest? So you can't just come up with a shotgun approach and say, well, since people are dying and they're dying because they're congregating, we're going to say that every single person has to be confined in a prison cell for 10 years. That's not narrowly tailored. But saying no meetings of more than 10 people in public for the next few months, I'd say that's sufficiently narrowly tailored. And finally, least restrictive means. Is there no better way of doing this? I think you score on all three. So I don't know why there's even a question of this. This is a traditional health-based public welfare police power exercise that meets the strict scrutiny standard.
Well, Bucky, what instrumentation can be employed to do this? So, okay, that's great. And let's say I'm a mayor of a small town, and there's by myself, I say I'm propagating no more church services in Rochelle, Georgia. Mm-hmm. I've just decided to do that. I have and if you go there, I'll have you arrested and put in prison for 6 months. I mean, and I'm going to keep this, and I'm going to go on vacation. I'm going to keep this in place. And if you go to church, I'm going to put you in prison and you'll have to stay there for 6 months. And I've just done this myself. And there's no sunsetting, there's this or that. What about that? I mean, can anyone do that? And apparently things like that have happened without any question.
Yeah,
mayors are without any other, they're just sort of ukasis that are being propagated by political executives everywhere.
Yes.
Comments?
And well, one that I know of is that I think the mayor, I don't think it was legislation, I think it was executive action saying we're going to show up during the church service and take down license tags. And I think they got backed off on that. I think that comes down to a question of what is the executive allowed to do by the city charter or by the county charter or by the state constitution. And once again, is he targeting just churches? If he says, yeah, we're going to allow the baseball game to go on and the spectators to show up, but if you go to church Sunday morning, I'm going to get you. Well, then you've got that strict scrutiny problem because it seems to be singling out religion on the basis of religion. Well,
maybe the practicality of it is, I mean, there's a small town. The only way people get together is churches, and maybe the thing can be so narrowly construed that it almost lets everybody else off, except where food is necessary or public entertainment or something like that. Yeah. Or you could say no gatherings of over 5 people. Unless where it's necessary for public entertainment and food consumption or something like that. That would be the other. I mean, or for mental health of the community or something. I don't know. Maybe there are ways.
Well, there are 2 answers. There's the theoretical answer and there's the practical answer. The practical answer is if you can get the court to agree with you, then yes, it's okay.
Well, yes.
The theoretical answer, once again, I think you would have to show, if you're making a distinction, sports events are okay, but church is not. You're going to have to, once again, under the strict scrutiny test, the government itself has the burden of showing why we are making this distinction and why that distinction meets the standards.
I'm going to accept your arguments, Bucky, as a charitable person I am, because I think you've won the argument. I really say that, but the takeaway, I agree with that. But I think my point is that if an executive promulgates a real restrictive thing on your individual liberty. So, okay, I mean, there's no more public meetings in presumably perpetuity in Wilcox County, and I've come up with some punishments that are in my mind to do that. I'll just put you in prison. I mean, and that seems to me very suspect.
Well,
and then how would you prevent that? And I think we've seen. I mean, it's very common. I mean, maybe you've seen it in Macon. I mean, good politicians in Macon, good people. I got it, and they've done reasonable things. But the people have said, "I'm going to close everything down. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that." And I don't think there's been any criminal. There haven't been any criminal punishment for this, or have there been, or could there be?
Well, let's back up. When you say, I'm going to put you in prison, what exactly do you mean by that? Do you mean I, as mayor, am going to order the police to put you in jail without a trial? Then you're talking martial law, and that is really up the ante. My answer is, the response to that is, you go into court and you get an injunction against the mayor. Now, if you get to the point where we've got martial law, I mean, if the rape gangs are going down the street, shooting houses up and things like that, then, yeah, I mean, I think the government is always going to have the ability to use superior force. So if you've got a law-abiding group of people who are not abiding by the curfew order, and they get arrested, yeah, you're going to have the courts available. If you've got the gangs going down the street shooting place, the government's never going to lose the battle in terms of force.
I keep pushing
there's
this.
There's a legitimacy.
What I'm doing is I would feel better about regulations. It was what would make me feel better about it. If it went through the normal way these things are propagated, going through some kind of legislative branch, some kind of fine tuning, and also some kind of sunsetting. It's a very transitory issue. We're only going to do this a little bit. And the criminal penalties or the penalties that are put there are not so onerous that, I would feel better about that. But what I see happening is different kinds of regulations, big, huge regulations, not little regulations, not a little regulation. But I'll say, well, take the state of California. 40 million people live there. The governor, as far as I understand, I don't know all the nuances, without any legislative whatever, I'm decreeing that this state will close down from now on. You may, number one, not go to any public gatherings. If you have to wear a mask, which I think is being put out there. You have to keep 6 feet apart. And you basically can go out once a day if necessary. Once a day you can walk out. You can walk your dog for 30 minutes. Some kind of really draconian things put through just with enormous consequences. With enormous consequences. So the 40 million people are no one's going to work. Schools are closed. There's no education. This and that. There's tremendous, extraordinary regulations being propagated in a huge state with presumably no particular sunset, or maybe some sunsetting, 3 weeks, a month, or whatever, but can be moved along at any point without any kind of legislative caveat. And I'm not sure, and this is an issue of consequence, as to what kind of penalties are in this. And it may be there, I don't know, maybe there are no penalties. Are there such penalties? And if penalties were put in there, I mean, how would the courts look upon that? And then finally, what I get into after pursuing this is the abuse that could occur for let's say, there's not really too much happening here, but the election is coming up, and I'm going to just do this, and I've got secondary motivation to do it, and I'll go on television and I'll say, well, the real thing in my mind is I want to be reelected here, and it looks good for me to be on television, fighting the evil people out there. But the evidence upon which I base such a draconian thing is quite suspect, and it has not been vetted by anyone. Let me repeat that. Has not been vetted by anyone. Instead, you're getting some kind of a very narrow opinion that about one thing or another that in scientific or medical circles would at least go through some kind of interchange back and forth. That's kind of the statement I'd make. Is this an okay situation for the United States to be in? And maybe it is in 2020. Any thoughts? You
do realize that you've asked about 20 questions. It's going to take me about 3 hours to answer.
Well, all right.
Okay.
That's the trick of any good whatever it is. Yeah. But okay.
All right. First point is I'm not a specialist in California law.
Any state. Georgia. Pick Georgia.
I'm not a specialist in Georgia.
Okay. Well.
Okay. But I'm a specialist in U.S. constitutional law.
All right.
So for all I know, there is a provision in the Georgia or the California the Constitution that says in a time of public health crisis, the chief executive can issue these regulations. Yes. Secondly, I think there's going to be a huge practical difference if there's no penalty. If he says, I'm decreeing that there's a shutdown, but there's no penalty for the shutdown. There's a phrase, if there's a remedy, there's a right. If there's a right, there's a remedy. If there's no remedy, there's no right. So if I declare that you've got to do this, but nothing happens to you if you don't, then the decree is empty. It's a paper tiger, and there's no problem. Thirdly, let's assume, just for the sake of argument, that the governor or the mayor does have that duly constituted authority, that you can find a provision somewhere, there's an enabling act like the Weimar Constitution that says, in a public health crisis,
The Hitler can take over.
The chief executive may issue a reasonable public health regulation.
Right.
So let's assume that what he's done.
The Reichstag fire is out there. And
so let's assume that what he has done has been authorized by the people of that state or the people of that city. If not at that moment, sometime when they wrote the Constitution or when they wrote the law. Even if that is the case, he is still subject to being dragged into a federal court and subjected to that strict scrutiny test. Unless, once again, the rape gangs are going down the street in a tank that they have liberated, in which case all bets are off. Martial law exists, and it's a matter of force majeure.
It's pretty, I mean, this is, probing this, I think, is an issue of consequence because it's very, very weird to pick that phrase, word. We're in the middle of this issue in the United States.
I'm going to stop you there. I'm going to back up. I'll give you the best example from history that immediately comes to mind, which doesn't have to do with public health, but I think this is what you're getting at. In 1790, Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, came up with the idea that in order to help the nation's economy, we need to emulate the Bank of England. We need a Bank of the United States. Yes. Congress ought to pass a law chartering a Bank of the United States. And his nemesis, Thomas Jefferson, who was Secretary of State, said that can't be done. The Constitution doesn't give Congress the power to do that. And Hamilton said, but it does. If you look here in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, we have the implied power to create the bank. And based on that, we created the bank. And Jefferson's argument is essentially, but we never meant to give Congress that power.
Yes.
And Hamilton says, well, you did.
Right.
So
yes.
I think I'm answering you. So you may say, the governor doesn't have that power. We never meant to give him that power. My response would be, well, if there's a reg somewhere that says in a situation like this he can do that,
well,
you should have drafted more carefully.
Well, what I'm getting into a little bit are checks and balances and how this abusive thing is out there. And I also
I'm not sure it is abusive. But
I'm probing some of the reasoning behind what's up here. I mean, it's complicated. And I think there could be a countervailing. In fact, we're seeing this now. We're seeing a countervailing argument about how to open the country up again. And apparently some states are going to do some things are going to do another. And the way the decisions are coming down, seemingly, is they're all being given to chief executives in narrow geographical areas. So you just decide what to do. And, and whose advice you're going to take, what kind of public interchange are we having, what are we getting out there? And this is a particular problem, I think, as we've sort of talked about, is the absence of testing. Because what's in the black box, I mean, presumably there's some demons in there. We see there's evidence of some demons in this black box. There's no question about that. But how vicious are those demons? And if we try and knock those demons off, are we going to just destroy everything to kill a demon or two? And there are many demons that are in the earth. I mean, people have tuberculosis, they die of hunger. There are all kinds of things that happen to people on the earth that are not good. And people die with influenza. 500,000 to 600,000 people die every year in the world with influenza. 1.5 million people die every year with tuberculosis, on and on. Well, it's a complicated kind of thing. And it's what needs to be carefully considered is that if we've given so much power to executives by saying, well, you have the implied power to do that.
Or maybe even the express power, depending on the jurisdiction.
And then you sort of, if I could say this, bumped up against the Weimar Constitution and the Reichstag fire. So presumably Hitler had the, and you've said before, never mention, it means you've lost if you mention the Nazis.
Yeah.
All right, I'll try not to.
I think it's called Gordon's Law.
I try not to do that.
Whoever appeals to, whoever says you're acting like Hitler first
right,
in the
you've
argument
lost,
loses.
Well, that's probably the case.
Well, I'm the one who mentioned the enabling.
Right, okay,
so
maybe you lost,
that,
but the takeaway message is that if this custom were out there, so okay, says the leader, I have this national emergency, I'm going to suspend liberty in the United States because and all the customs and all the protections for civil rights, everything we have is totally been cast out because I've declared a national emergency and there's no way you can prevent from me doing whatever I wish to do. And the information that you receive is going to be when from my nightly press conference or whatever. I'll say, and I'll emphasize how big the crisis is and how this limitation of your personal liberty and life and everything else is being cast out the window. What kind of check is there on that? What kind of check do we have on these, and particularly so if we're going to get some kind of limitation on elections? I mean, if you say, just to say this, I'm the governor, I'm running, I mean, to pick anybody, I'm not particularly our governor, I'm the governor of South Dakota or whatever. And the election is coming up, I'm likely to lose, but it's extremely dangerous to have people go to the polls. So I'm only going to, and I have very motivated supporters, no more than 3 people at a time can come to the polls. And I've arranged for 100 of my people to come out. Presumably, and also that's an issue of great consequence because the electoral cycle is upon us. I mean, where are we in this? The electoral cycle, the laws that are on the books, the nature of the national crisis. Is this truly what's up there? The absence of appropriate testing, and the fact that an incredible amount of problem is occurring in New York City, right in the media capital, certainly the country, maybe the world. That if you look at the amount of damage, injury, whatever, it's happening in New York City is an enormous amount. Throwing the Jersey suburbs in there, just using that as a country, it matches any country in the world where there are deaths. And there may be special set of circumstances that exist in that metropolitan area with, I think in Queens, 800 languages are spoken, millions and millions of people are going back and forth. Everyone is cheek to jowl there, gathered in one area, and multi-generational households. Lots of reasons to say that place is different than other places. And the influence is so powerful. Maybe it's like the Reichstag fire. I don't know if that's the case, but I'm just putting an argument out there that we need to pay a lot of attention to the validity of liberty limitations. And we really need to get a very powerful justification for what's happening here. I'd say that.
Well, the powerful justification is, if you compare this to the Spanish flu in 1918, 100 million people died from it.
Yes.
If you scale that up to our population today, that would be what? What was the population?
60 million, maybe 70 million, well, maybe 100.
Yeah, so you're talking
about 3 times that.
You're talking
3 million.
Yeah, so if you scaled that and adjusted, you'd be talking close to 1 billion people worldwide dying from this if we don't use our modern science of immunology and social distancing and stuff to cut. That's a pretty darn good justification.
Go ahead.
I would further argue. I think the ultimate check is, as long as the courts are open, American citizens can do what they are better at than anybody in the world, which is sue. I mean, this is, as I tell my classes, you are not a true red-blooded American unless you have sued somebody in the last year. You know who you are.
Yes.
And if the situation is so bad that the courts have closed down, then I would say whatever is done is necessary, because Americans, I think maybe a bit less now than before, but we have had this respect for the rule of law. Abraham Lincoln essentially imposed martial law when the country was literally tearing itself to pieces, and even he gave every indication that if he had lost the presidential election of 1864, that he would have freely stepped down and not tried to hold on to power. So, the ultimate limitation is in the average American's sense of respect for the rule of law. And if somebody went completely off the deep end on that, and he ordered the army in to shoot up the neighborhood or to conduct mass concentration camps, that's why the American right is so fervently supportive of the Second Amendment. So.
Well, actually, you've thrown some things at me. Maybe I'll try and hit them back ad seriatim. I mean, okay. So I think one of the issues is the lethality of the disease, and that's to start with that. There's a big question as to the way these statistics have been promulgated. And what goes on, these models are put out there, and the models, the garbage in, garbage out, the models for, I won't overkill this, there's something called an R-naught number. I'm sure the politicians have never heard of that. But it's how you can pass disease along to another person. And so I think in traditional influenza, that R-naught number is 1.2, meaning that the higher the number, the more you can pass it along to. And so the initial number that was put out for this virus, this incredible number of 2.65. And so this tremendous number is out there that's put out there with other things, and these numbers were then arranged that came out at this enormous number. And so and just to say this, the facts have been presented to politicians, and the facts are often quite flawed, very flawed. So if Donald Trump is saying, as you did, well, they said there'd be 2 million people here, you come in and you talk to the president and someone says to them, you have to seize world control because 2 million people will die unless you take over the country. And that just figure is put there without any vetting, without going back and forth. So these models are not being appropriately vetted by anybody. And so, and there are lots of models out there, and what a normal person would do, in my opinion, is they would put the models together and they'd merge them and come up with some kind of number. Instead, they're just picking certain models, whatever, and then finally what occurs is the actual, because we don't have testing, we don't have an idea about how ubiquitous the virus is. We don't know, and I think this is an issue of substantial consequence. When people look at the numbers on television and they say we've got 20,000 deaths in the US or 25,000 deaths or whatever, firstly, the numbers are very, very low compared to 2 million. The other point is the way these are being counted is anybody that has the diagnosis of the virus, no matter what the etiology of their death is being counted as a virus death. And so let's say you're in a nursing home, someone's about to have a heart attack, or they're in the last, they have Alzheimer's, they can barely move around. They have a pulmonary embolus, there's no autopsy. They happen to have had the diagnosis of coronavirus. They're counted as a death. So one of the things going on with this enormous, I guess, I won't say change in the liberties of the country. This enormous change in the liberty of the country is based on this argument, and the argument has not, in my opinion, appropriately been vetted. So, particularly because of absence of testing, how invasive, how infective the story is. What we can say, and I'll accept this, is in the United States we've had 20,000 deaths. I think the number could be overstated, but I'll accept that. The influenza death rate in the country might be, the numbers go up and down, but certainly 80,000 was a recent death rate with no comments about it. 80,000 people dying, whatever. The other point that's been said is, this is the argument, we've put these restrictions in place, and that's the reason that we don't have 10 million people dead right now. It's because I've stopped your liberty. I've totally closed the place down. If that had not been the case, there would be 50 million dead people here. Well, and the one country that hasn't done this, well, there are different stories about that, but Sweden is a country that's been, I guess, attacked because they put in place a more liberal policy. And there are some restrictions, no more than 50 people. You have to, there's some things there. On the other hand, the schools are open, people go to work, and there hasn't been an incredible social destruction. And what's said about this is, well, the Swedes are going to repent because so many people have died. And maybe I've compared Sweden with their neighboring Scandinavian country, Denmark. And it's true enough that in Sweden, some facts about that, the same amount of coronavirus is present in both countries. So Denmark had very restrictions. Sweden did not. Sweden has the same infection rate as Denmark. Additionally, Sweden has kept the schools open. And in both countries, there have been no deaths, as is the world picture here, of only very unusual of anyone to die under 20 years of age. So the Swedes kept the schools open, no one died. And what has happened, however, is the Swedish death rate because of all this lack of restriction, is double that of Denmark. So there's been a price here. However, all the death rates, 88% of the deaths have occurred in people over 70 years old, and almost half of that number in people over 80. So and a substantial number of people over 90. So the elderly have had a higher death rate in this arrangement, with a lot more freedom there. And other countries are seeing that real extraordinary restrictions, there might be an argument to moderate those. And that's where the country's debate is right now. That's what I thought about.
Well, I've got to get in a quick final one. These models are presumably being produced by specialists.
Yes.
And so, what are you going to do if you're the president? You don't blow off the word of a specialist. That's all I would say. So, you can either do the safe approach and try to keep people alive, or the gamble that kills them. Of course, the safe approach could cause property destruction and the loss of lots and lots of money. So you pay your money and take your choice.
My final comment to that is, yes, I understand it's difficult to make correct decisions. The stopping debate, stopping interchange, trying to look at the different facts is a national necessity right now. And opposing opinions should not be suppressed. The idea of how much restriction is necessary is an open question, in my opinion. And we need to really probe what we gain and lose with our liberty laws.
Agreed.
Okay, well, thank you. And no handshakes.
Right.
No handshakes. Thanks for being here.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.